I'm now delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Rachel Lasser. Rachel joins us all the way from the US, where she is the CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Americans United is in many ways similar to the National Secular Society. It is an educational and advocacy organization dedicated to advancing the constitutional principles of church-state separation as the only way to ensure freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not to believe, for all Americans. Many of us in the UK have been watching America's apparent erosion of church-state separation under President Trump and the rise of the Christian right and horror and bewilderment. The US has long been a beacon of secular democracy for human rights campaigners around the world, and its shift in politics is deeply concerning. Rachel is here to explain what's going on in US politics and what this could mean for, hopefully, and what this could mean for other countries, including the UK. I'd like you to give her a very warm welcome, especially as this is her first international conference in her role as CEO of American United. And for that, we're very glad to have her here today. Thank you.
I'd like to start by reading you a quote from an American leader. "The right to believe or not believe is the most fundamental of freedoms. When religious liberty is denied or destroyed, we know that other freedoms, freedom of speech, of press, of assembly, and even democratic institutions themselves are imperiled." Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to who might have said this? Kennedy. Who else? Obama? Jefferson. I can tell you that when I asked this question back on the other side of the pond, every time someone has said Thomas Jefferson. But in fact, these are Vice President Pence's remarks at the U.S. State Department's Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom from last July. These words sound fine, right? He's recognizing non-theists. He's acknowledging the importance of religious freedom to democracy. We agree. It sure doesn't sound like the words of someone whose use of religious freedom to undermine the rights of LGBTQ people was so extreme back when he was governor of Indiana that the state lost $60 million of business over it. And it doesn't sound like the words of someone who, in concert with Trump and his allies, is making use of every possible avenue he can to grant special privileges to far-right evangelical Christians, while limiting the rights of LGBTQ people, women, and religious minorities, and the non-religious. Less surprising is how Pence's speech ends, with the declaration that belief in God is what gives Americans freedom. Quote, "For as the Bible tells us, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So freedom always wins when faith in him is held high. May God bless you and your nations, and may God bless the United States of America." The story I want to tell tonight is about the clever strategy that the religious right and the highest levels of government officials in America are using to co-opt the term religious freedom to advance their political agenda. It's about the rhetoric not matching the reality. It's an ugly story about the politicization of one of America's most sacred principles and the use of it to discriminate and hurt people. And it's a story about a grave threat to true religious freedom for all Americans. First, I'll spend a little time reminding us what true religious freedom means, although we heard some from Dr. Ahmed Shaheen this morning, why you can't have it without church-state separation and how it's core to America's identity. Then I'll describe how religious freedom today is under attack, and what's worse, how it's being misused to undermine true religious freedom and advance a regressive social agenda. Third, I'll discuss the source of that attack And finally, I'll talk about how my organization is focused on building a national movement to safeguard religious freedom in America for generations to come, and hopefully offer some transferable thoughts. But before I speak further, I would like to thank you all and the National Secular Society for inviting me to be with you today. It is striking how alike Americans United and the National Secular Society's missions are, and I'm honored to be here with so many of you who are doing this invaluable work in this part of the world and other parts of the world. So first, a short history lesson on religious freedom and how core it is to America. And believe me, everyone in America needs this refresher now because it's so misunderstood in today's political climate and so easy to take for granted. When the Puritans fled England and then Holland in search of religious freedom, it was only for themselves. Their Massachusetts Bay colony was set up as a theocracy, and any deviation from a strict system of religious laws could lead to fines, imprisonment, or grotesque forms of punishment, such as flogging or being confined in a pillory. But as many people representing other faiths came to America, diversity spread, and a real thirst for meaningful religious liberty began to grow in several colonies. All we needed to set off the spark was for bold thinkers to demand the right of conscience. Historians, as well as Supreme Court justices, widely regard the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom as the foundation for how the founders of the Constitution and First Amendment approached matters of religion and government. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom in 1777 to protect those who deviated or dissented from the state-sanctioned Anglican Church at that time in the new state of Virginia. It became law in 1785 thanks to the help of his buddy, James Madison. For modern-day Americans, it's truly hard to believe that Virginia actually required its citizens to attend Sunday Church of England services. Journalist Frederick Clarkson notes that failure to attend services was the most prosecuted crime in Virginia for many years. But with the passage of the Virginia statute, people were no longer required to worship at a state church. Jefferson emphasized that the aim of this statute was to protect, quote, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian, the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and the infidel of every denomination. Take a minute to think how radical that idea was in 1785. It's also important to note that Jefferson's list includes the Gentile and the Christian. Back in that day, it was well understood that religious freedom was key to protecting and even strengthening all beliefs, including mainstream Christianity. As Roger Williams, the Baptist theologian who founded Rhode Island in 1636 as the first colony with separation of church and state, famously said, "Forced worship stinks in the nostrils of God." In other words, religious freedom allows people to come to their beliefs themselves instead of being coerced. America's founders got that. So religious freedom was designed to protect all Americans' freedom of conscience, from the Christian to the non-theist. Forging our own spiritual path is a great American tradition. When Jefferson, who went on to be our third president, was asked to describe his faith, he replied, "I am of a sect by myself, as far as I know." And one of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, could have identified himself with no religion, what we would call a none, N-O-N-E. Lincoln never joined a Christian church, and while he spoke of God and accepted the idea of an all-powerful creator, it's unclear if he believed in the divinity of Jesus or the Trinity, core concepts of the Christian faith. As a young man, Lincoln attended a revival and was asked by an evangelist if he intended to go to heaven or hell. Lincoln reportedly quipped, "I intend to go to Congress." It's unfortunate, however, how often throughout America's history, our ideals do not match our reality. I'll give more on how this is playing out today related to religious freedom, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least pause to note that at the time of our founding and before, in many instances, Native Americans and slaves were forced to follow Christianity instead of their traditional religious practices. Back to the ideal. And again, we heard much on this morning. Religious freedom should include the freedom to be religious, not to be religious, to change our belief system over the course of our lifetime, to practice whatever religion we want in whatever way we want, so long as we aren't harming others, and to freely discuss and even criticize religion in general or one religion in particular. Religious freedom recognizes that our choices around religion are so deeply personal that for many of us, they shape our core identities and at least one of our core communities. It acknowledges that people's religious or non-religious identities can be so powerful that some are willing to abandon their homelands or even die to preserve them. America's commitment to religious freedom has greatly enhanced our diversity. Today, thousands of religions are practiced across our shores. America just would not be America without it. I will add that for me personally, as an American Jew, America's commitment to religious freedom is crucial to feeling secure. It gives me and my family a feeling of equal belonging and affords us equal opportunity. It has enabled me to do so many things that I take for granted. Basic things, like sending my kids to public school without fearing that they'll be taught a religion that is not our family's, raising my kids to be part of a Jewish community and other communities, and being eligible for even the highest level government jobs, just like my Christian neighbors. And my neighbors really are Christian. America's commitment to religious freedom also enabled my relatives and millions of other American ancestors, from the Protestants and Catholics of the 1700s to today's Muslims, Hindus, and Christian and Coptic Christians, and so many others, to flee religious persecution, rebuild their lives, and even thrive. And I'll pause to emphasize that separating religion and government is the linchpin of religious freedom. When the Founding Fathers wrote the First Amendment, they baked church-state separation right into it. Here's Jefferson again, for example, this time writing about the First Amendment in 1802 in a famous letter to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut. Quote, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." As you just heard, the First Amendment has two religion clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, and they work together to protect religious freedom. The Establishment Clause, which is really about the non-establishment of religion, puts a limit on the Free Exercise Clause. No one can exercise their religion such that they are using the government's power to impose their beliefs on others. That's what church-state separation is all about. The Establishment Clause prohibits the government from endorsing or disparaging any one religion or religion over non-religion in order to protect religious freedom for all. Religious freedom and church-state separation should be a given in America. Unfortunately, though, the wall of separation between church and state is crumbling in the United States today. So let's get into it. A few weeks ago, I met with a group of students from Stanford University. They were on spring break and came for a trip to Washington to study religion and politics. I posed the following question to the room. When you think about religious freedom, what comes to mind? Right out of the gate, one student responded, homophobia. There was a consensus in the room. Rather than the lofty ideals I spoke of earlier, like freedom and equality, this group of students associates religious freedom with discrimination. How sad. And they're not crazy to think this. Here's another true story to illustrate why. Amy Madonna lives in Simpsonville, South Carolina, with her husband and 3 kids, 2 of whom are autistic. Sitting in her living room earlier this year, I witnessed what a patient and devoted mother she is. Amy's dad grew up in the foster care system at a time when foster parents weren't well vetted, and he had a rough time. As an adult, he wanted to provide foster kids with a better experience than he had had, and he welcomed hundreds of the most vulnerable foster kids into his home, providing Amy with many brothers and sisters, some for a few days and some for a few months or longer. Now, Amy wants to teach her kids the same values and provide a loving family experience to a new generation of foster kids. Since her children have special needs, her and her husband's plan was first to volunteer so that they could ensure a good fit before fostering. Amy knew that Miracle Hill Ministries was the largest and most advertised foster care agency in her community, and that they allowed both adults and children to volunteer. She felt it would be the perfect arrangement for her family. Miracle Hill felt the same until they learned that Amy is Catholic. At that point, they told her, quote, "I'm sorry, we only allow volunteers and mentors who are Protestant Christians." It turns out that Miracle Hill, which received $600,000 of federal and state taxpayer money last year, serves only evangelical Protestants. It's not just Amy who they've rejected. Miracle Hill has also denied 2 Jewish couples the ability to volunteer, even though they, like Amy, were highly qualified. When the South Carolina governor, Henry McMaster, and the Trump administration found out about what was going on, rather than denouncing this government-funded discrimination, they doubled down. Governor McMaster issued an executive order specifically to allow state-funded foster care agencies to reject prospective parents who didn't share their religion. Then, on January 23rd of this year, just a day after the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, which granted abortion rights in America, the Trump-Pence administration announced it too would allow all South Carolina foster care agencies to refuse to work with anyone they deem the wrong religion, granting them an explicit exemption from federal anti-discrimination regulations. Unbelievably, the Trump administration's stated basis for licensing religious discrimination is the, quote, religious freedom of Miracle Hill and other faith-based foster care agencies. This is why these Stanford kids aren't wrong when they say religious freedom is about discrimination these days. In February, my organization, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, filed a lawsuit in the U.S. federal court on behalf of Amy Madonna to stop the federal government and the South Carolina governor from authorizing and encouraging discrimination with taxpayer dollars. The lawsuit, called Madonna versus U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, alleges that permitting governmental discrimination based on religion violates the First Amendment's religious freedom protections. When the government gives special religious exemptions and taxpayer money to Miracle Hill, they endorse Miracle Hill's religious discrimination. The government should never be in the business of endorsing the belief that only evangelical Protestants make good parents. And the government should not sanction the use of religion to cause harm to others, because forcing someone to bear the cost of someone else's religion is giving special treatment to one set of religious beliefs over others. At Americans United, we like to say it this way: religious freedom should be a shield that protects people, not a sword to harm others or discriminate. In this case, the government is misusing religious freedom to cause unmistakable and grave harm on many fronts. There's harm to the prospective parents like Amy, who are being discriminated against and turned away based solely on their religious beliefs. There's harm to the more than 5,000 kids who are in the foster care system in South Carolina in need of homes. And there's harm to the kids who are being placed by these agencies in homes where evangelical Christianity is imposed on them, and if they don't share that faith to start out with. And let's not leave out the harm to all Americans whose taxpayer money is funding this. So many of his actions that Trump labels as being about protecting religious freedom are really about elevating one narrow fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity and misusing religious freedom to harm others, usually minority religions, people in the LGBTQ community, and women. To name just a few more examples, in January, the Trump administration released a regulation allowing businesses and universities to deny women access to birth control that's promised them under our healthcare laws if they have a religious or moral exemption. We have sued the Trump administration to challenge this rule. Just a few weeks ago, Trump's Department of Health and Human Services released another regulation that allows doctors, healthcare workers, hospitals, and anyone working at them, including receptionists and janitors, to refuse to participate in any healthcare for which they have a moral or religious objection. This would include life-saving services like ending an ectopic pregnancy, and it could even allow a doctor to attempt to deny fertility treatments to an interfaith couple or a nurse to refuse to treat a transgender patient who has the flu. Americans United is preparing to take action. And this is not just happening in the Trump administration. There's also a full frontal campaign taking place at a lower level of government in our state legislatures to codify a far-right evangelical Christian nation and allow discrimination in the name of religious freedom. And it's called Project Blitz. Anyone heard of Project Blitz in here? A couple. Backed by 3 religious right groups, Project Blitz's strategy is to pass an increasingly ambitious set of state laws, starting with ones that require prominently displaying "In God We Trust" in public schools and teaching Bible classes in public schools, and eventually escalating to laws that would permit religion to be used to discriminate. Their 150-page playbook, replete with 21 model bills, strategy, and messaging guidance, was distributed to more than 800 state legislators across America in 2018. Already in 2019, over 50 Project Blitz bills have been introduced so far in state legislatures, and most are still in session. Together, Trump, Pence, and their emboldened allies are weaponizing religious freedom and turning what is supposed to be a shield that protects into a sword that hurts people, stops social progress, and actually robs people of true religious freedom. Trump is certainly not spearheading these attacks on religious freedom merely for his own edification or to advance his deeply held religious beliefs. In fact, the evidence remains to be seen whether Trump has any type of guiding ethical belief system at all. Rather, President Trump and Vice President Pence are pandering to a small group of far-right, mostly white evangelical Christians because they form the base of their voting bloc. It's clear from the data. Even as of a few months ago, Trump maintains around a 70% approval rating among white evangelicals, which is nearly 20 points higher than among any other religious group. This group has outsized power in our elections because white evangelicals vote at incredibly high rates, while so many other Americans sit out our elections, especially our liberal young people and people of color. White evangelicals comprise only 15.3% of our population, but in 2016 and 2018 elections, they were 26% of voters. 81% of their votes went to Trump in 2016, and nearly 70% of their votes went to Trump's party, the Republicans, in 2018. As conservative U.S. white evangelical leader Jerry Falwell Jr. said, evangelicals have found their dream president. Trump says the same. Last summer, he told a group of conservative evangelical Christians that he had to the White House for a dinner in their honor, quote, "The support you've given me has been incredible, but I really don't feel guilty because I've given you a lot back, just about everything I promised. And as one of our great pastors just said, actually, you've given us much more, sir, than you promised." And I think that's true in many respects. Let's take stock for a moment. We know that Trump's government is promoting policies that give special religious freedom privileges to white evangelical Christians in order to pander to his base. But why are white evangelical Christians advancing this regressive social agenda of discrimination? The answer is white Christian fragility. A narrow segment of white Christians, driven by white Christian fragility, are leading the fight to hold on to white Christian power in America. Sure, it's a myth that America was founded to be a Christian nation. The U.S. Constitution is secular and contains zero references to Jesus, Christianity, or even God in the body of the document. Yet, at the same time, as my friend Robbie Jones writes in his book called The End of White Christian America, for most of the country's history, white Christian America, the cultural and political edifice built primarily by white Protestant Christians, set the tone for our national conversations and shaped American ideals. But today, many white Christian Americans feel profoundly anxious as their numbers and influence are waning. And waning they are. Starting in 2014, white Christians ceased to be a majority in America. And if you drill down to white Christian Protestants, the group to which white evangelical Christians belong, they are now down to just a third of Americans. On top of all of that, predictions are that by 2045, America will cease to be majority white. White Christian fragility describes a mental state that aims to preserve white Christian privilege. So let's first share an understanding of what white fragility is, and then we can add the Christian variable. Robin DiAngelo, a white scholar of what she calls white studies, has defined white fragility as, quote, "a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves." According to DiAngelo, quote, "these moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. White fragility," DiAngelo explains, "functions to reinstate white racial equilibrium. In other words, white fragility maintains white dominance." A classic example of white fragility is when a person of color calls out a white person for something racist they often unknowingly said or did, and the white person, rather than facing and owning it, accuses them of reverse racism. White Christian fragility is a similarly fragile state in reaction to having white Christian privilege challenged. It is a reflex, a defensiveness aimed at protecting white Christian power. What does white Christian fragility look like today in America? It looks like a mostly white evangelical Christian foster care agency claiming that they are being discriminated against, their words, not mine, if they aren't allowed to continue to refuse to serve LGBTQ people and those like Amy Madonna who do not share their religion. So white Christian fragility helps us to understand the roots of Trump's base's support for the president, a desire to maintain their cultural power. It helps explain why white evangelicals continue their unwavering support for a president who seems to have lived his life in a manner that is antithetical to what most Christians, and even they, call Christian values. It also explains why Trump has repeatedly given special status to white Christians, from his Muslim ban to his repeated policies that allow religious freedom to be used to justify discrimination in foster care, health care, and government services. These policies operate to cede power back to white evangelical Christians. Now for the million-dollar question, what can we do about this? Americans United's Board of Trustees and our staff have spent this last year thinking about this very question, and I'm excited to share with you the product of some of our new thinking. While my answer assumes the context of America, I'm hopeful that there are many transferable strategies. We know what we want: an America where everyone can freely choose a faith and support it voluntarily, or follow no religious or spiritual path at all, and where the government does not promote religion over non-religion or favor one faith over another. In this America, the government is never in the business of imposing one set of religious beliefs on the rest of us, or giving special privileges to any one religion, or allowing religion to be used to nullify protections for vulnerable communities, or to stop America's progress towards achieving our ideals. We know that the clock is ticking, with the opposition chipping away at our freedom every day in our private lives, workplaces, schools, government services, and healthcare systems. But too few Americans know or think about what religious freedom is actually about and how foundational it is to our lives and our country. And similarly, not enough Americans are aware of the extent to which church-state separation is under attack today. So the answer is, we have to make more noise. We have to remind people about the importance of church-state separation, take back the meaning of true religious freedom, become more visible, and ignite a national movement in America that insists on separating religion and government. Yes, we need to continue to sue in court and shape public policy in Congress and across the states. And Americans United will never stop doing this. But we must make sure that we are also inspiring younger people who are tirelessly and passionately fighting for the future of America to put church-state separation at the top of their priority list. And to do this, we must connect the dots between church-state separation and other key issues that they care about, like racial justice, LGBTQ equality, and reproductive freedom. We just did this last week when, for the first time ever, Americans United took a position in support of the Equality Act, landmark legislation in Congress that just passed the House of Representatives that provides long overdue protections for LGBTQ people in employment, housing, credit, government services, and public businesses, while simultaneously ensuring in explicit language in that bill that religious freedom cannot be misused to undermine these protections. That is an explicit provision in the bill. AU's support of this bill Americans United's support of this bill makes clear how interconnected this church-state separation issue is with LGBTQ equality and with preventing harm to real people. Our issue can be very cerebral. To succeed in building a strong national movement, we also know we need to broaden and diversify our supporters to include people of color, who will soon be a majority in our country. We will build Black and brown allies in our youth-focused work, and also when we strengthen our already extensive ties to the faith community. The non-religious are growing in America, and they will always form a crucial block of Americans United supporters. At the same time, with 70% of the country still identifying as Christian, we need to continue to build Christian allies alongside our religious minority friends and bring Christians, religious minorities, and the non-religious together to advocate for church-state separation. We must not let our opponents' false claims that we are anti-religion continue to cost us support or scare our faith allies away from proudly standing with us. We know that church-state separation is good for religion, and many religious people agree. In fact, the head of the National Council of Churches, an ecumenical partnership of 38 different Christian groups in America, just joined our board of trustees. Yeah, it was good. So that we are speaking in the most effective ways to our different audiences, Americans United is embarking on our first ever public opinion research. This research will give us insights into what modern day messages work to reach the people we must mobilize. Americans United plans to start fortifying our national movement by creating state networks in 20 states over the next 5 years. Our state networks will engage supporters and young people with digital advocacy and offer them a ladder of engagement. If we know one thing already, it's that younger Americans are not big joiners. So we will test strategies to build these modern day networks as we go. In the end, we know that we will prevail because we are fighting on the side of fundamental American ideals. To all of us here, wherever we live, may we use our combined strength to bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice and freedom and equality for all, just a little bit sooner. Thank you.